You can have the most compelling science in the world and still lose your readers by burying that science in complex writing. And you might be surprised to learn that many of the refinements I make as an editor don't require advanced training in English and don't involve intuition or waving a magic wand. They are just tiny writing habits that you can fix when you know what to look out for. And when you notice these habits and change those habits, you will instantly see a difference in your writing. So this video is part of an ongoing series of videos where you can watch me work through and refine real examples of scientific and medical writing. And if we haven't met, hello, my name is Crystal Heron. I'm a trained biomedical scientist turned clinical researcher and now scientific and medical editor. And since 2011, I've helped scientists, clinicians, and medical writers confidently write compelling manuscripts, grants, and more. So before we dive into the example, I have a couple of things to note. First, the example includes a few sentences that I drafted for this video based on something that I read and that reflects some of the writing problems that I saw in that original piece. Although I could use the actual excerpt, which was published in an open access article with a CC BY license, I don't want to publicly critique someone's writing without their explicit permission. So I create an example that has those same problems. But if you are interested in having me review an excerpt of your own writing in an upcoming video, you can submit a sample of your writing through a link in the description box. And if you're feeling a little nervous about that idea, I can keep you anonymous and even modify or redact the text like I did for this video. So if you want to learn more about that and submit an excerpt, you'll find a link in the description box. Second, editing is circular and often requires multiple passes through the text. And so this could mean that making a change later in a document means you need to go back and change something earlier in a document or to even undo a change that you made before. And that is just part of the process and is likely something that you will see in this video. And third, I want to emphasize that there isn't one right way to write or edit something. In this video, I will share one way to revise the example, but that is not the only possible way. Often, when I edit, I will experiment with text by writing multiple versions and then choosing the one that I like best. And sometimes I need to work more closely with the authors to ensure that the details are accurate and precise. Okay, let's get to the example. So here is the example, and I'm going to read it aloud, so bear with me for a moment. This example reads, one of the primary therapies for atrial fibrillation patients is the use of oral anticoagulants, which can effectively prevent blood clot formation in the heart, thereby reducing the risk of a stroke. Numerous studies have indicated that using oral anticoagulants may also reduce the risk of cognitive decline. However, the optimal use of oral anticoagulants necessitates patient education and that patients actively engage in the management of their condition. So this example, there's a few things going on. Some are good and some can be improved. We're going to start big picture, talking about the structure, and then we'll drill down into the details. So structure-wise, the overall structure is pretty good. It starts by introducing the therapy in the first part, and then it shares the benefits of that therapy, and then it shares the challenges with that therapy. So the overall structure flows well. The other thing that is great about this sentence is that it has sentences with varied sentence lengths. And so this is something that is really important for adding rhythm and flow to your writing. And so the first sentence contains 32 words, and then the second sentence contains 16 words, and then the third sentence contains 22 words. And so there is some nice variation in the sentence length. Now, I will add that I encourage authors to use sentences that are no more than 25 words. An occasional longer sentence is okay, but to really aim for that length. and then to mix up the lengths of sentences to add that rhythm and interest. Because when the sentences are all the same length, it can make writing boring and monotonous. And I've found that a lot of researchers and clinicians tend to use sentences that are around 30 to 35 words long. And so you want to try to avoid that. And so it's really the first sentence here that's a little bit long, and so we'll keep that in mind as we work through the text. So the other thing we'll keep in mind too, of course, is the overall length, because we're often facing word limits and page limits and character limits. And so this particular example is 69 words long. So we'll see what we end up having at the end. Okay, so let's get into the details. So as I review the example, I will point out some things that I'm noticing in the text, and then we will start to work through them, and I'll show you how I would revise them. And so let's start with the first sentence. So some things that I'm noticing is that we have one of the, which is a little wordy. We could make that a little bit more concise. We have some longer words in here. So primary has 3 syllables. In general, it's better to aim for as many words as possible that are 2 syllables or less, and it will just make the writing easier and more enjoyable to read. And so we're seeing that with primary. We're seeing that with therapies. There's a shorter substitution. I also noticed this phrase here, atrial fibrillation patients. So this is labeling language that can contribute to stigma and bias, and so we're going to want to fix that as well. And I will also say that this is just one way that inclusive language can appear in writing. There are many other ways, and if you're interested in knowing more about that, I do have a free course on inclusive language fundamentals, and I will add a link to it in the description box in case you want to check that out. Okay, so some other things that I'm noticing in this sentence, we have the use of here, this phrase. So be careful about words that are sandwiched between the word the and the word of. And oftentimes nominalizations can be challenging, and we'll get to that in a bit because there are some nominalizations in here that we'll work through. But in this case, the word use, when it's between the words the and of, I say that it's masquerading as a nominalization because oftentimes we can simplify it. So, okay, what are some other things that I'm noticing? We have oral anticoagulants. So anticoagulants it's a long word, but it's a technical term. That is one that we really need to keep. And so we want to focus on shortening the other language where we can. Let's see what else we notice. So we have a clause here that interrupts part of the sentence, and that's not always a bad thing, just something to consider that when there are lots of commas and clauses in sentences, it can be a little bit harder to digest. We also have effectively is often a technical term, but it's not always needed. Adverbs and adjectives can often be deleted, so that might be something that we do. And then we have thereby can often be reduced. And then we have a couple of other words here that we could condense. But you know what? Let's dive into the text itself. Okay, so as I work through making changes in this example, the track changes will be turned on so that you can see the changes that I'm making. Now, one thing that I might instinctually do at first is to change one of the to A. So it'd be a primary therapy would be my first approach. And this removes a couple of words. However, what happens is you have a primary therapy for atrial fibrillation patients. That is the subject of your sentence. And it's a little long. Ideally, we want something short and concrete. And so I actually want to do a little bit of rephrasing to make this a bit clearer for readers. And so what I actually want to do is reorder the information in this sentence. And the other thing I'm going to do as well is I'm actually going to take this comma right here and I'm going to turn it into a period, and we're going to shorten that sentence. And then later we're going to deal with this part of the sentence. But for now, I want to take this information and I'm going to reorganize it. Now, before I reorganize it, I just want to highlight a couple of other things. One is I mentioned earlier the atrial fibrillation patients. using inclusive language, you want this to actually be patients with atrial fibrillation. And this way you are not labeling the patients. Instead, you are indicating that they have a particular condition. So that is the ideal way to write about this. Now, the thing I will mention though is that not all conditions are considered labeling when you write them in that way. There are some exceptions, for example, autism. And I go into all those details in the Inclusive Language Fundamentals course, which you can check out. Okay, so the other thing here that I notice, I mentioned the use of here where we have this masquerading nominalization. And so I want to consider that in revising this. So what I want to do is I want to make patients with atrial fibrillation the subject of this sentence. So I'm going to go ahead and capitalize that P to make it the beginning of the sentence. And then I'm going to say instead, patients with atrial fibrillation are often treated with oral anticoagulants. And so this way, now we have a much shorter subject with patients with atrial fibrillation. And then we say that they are often treated with oral anticoagulants. So now we have a nice, concise sentence with a clear subject immediately followed by a verb. And then we've simplified some of the language, but we're still keeping that longer technical term of anticoagulants. So that's what we're going to do for the first sentence. Now let's deal with the rest of the sentence. So here we have, it's a fragment at this point. There is no subject for this sentence, what we have here. So what I want to do is add a subject that's going to connect directly to the sentence before. And so I want to look for something in this sentence that I can grab onto. And so one way to do that is to grab onto the subject, which is patients with atrial fibrillation. The other way is to find something else in the sentence to connect to. So it could be something at the end, or it could be something that relates to the entire sentence. In this case, this fragment is talking about oral anticoagulants. And rather than repeating oral anticoagulants at the end and then again at the beginning of the next sentence, I instead just want to say these drugs. So I'm going to start with these drugs. And that will help to connect this sentence to the preceding sentence. And so we no longer need which here, and we have these drugs can effectively prevent blood clot formation. In this case, we really don't need the word effectively because we already have that they can prevent. So we don't need this word, so we can take that out. And so now we have these drugs can prevent blood clot formation in the heart, thereby reducing the risk of stroke. So what I want to do here, thereby, it feels a little academic. It's also 2 syllables and it can be replaced with 1 syllable. And so instead, I want to say which reduces the risk of a stroke. And actually, while we're at it, we can delete the word a. It's not needed. So now we have these drugs can prevent blood clot formation in the heart, which reduces the risk of stroke. So now we have a much clearer sentence that connects to the preceding sentence. Okay, let's take a look at the next sentence. So there's a lot of things happening in this second sentence. So the first thing I notice is the word numerous. It's used quite often in academia. It's multiple syllables. Usually my first instinct is to just change this to many. We're going to do a little more with this, but that is just one tiny change to make that just makes the text a little bit more readable. Okay, so we have many studies have indicated. We have passive voice here with have indicated, so that's something that we want to keep in mind. We want to be very careful about when we're using passive voice. And I'll also say that if you are interested in learning about when to use and when to avoid passive voice, I have a free course called the Passive Voice Primer, and you can take that and learn all about the ways that passive voice can be beneficial or when you want to avoid it. Okay, what else do I notice in this sentence? So we have oral anticoagulants again. We have a little bit of hedging, which with may also, and so that's actually something that can be important to include depending on what the data has showed. We also have the risk of cognitive decline. I think that all looks pretty good. But I have also noticed that we have the subject here, many studies. And that subject does not connect to either one of the preceding statements. They do not mention anything about studies. And so what I want to do is choose a subject that will connect to the preceding sentences. And so what I could do is possibly use oral anticoagulants. But the other thing that I'm thinking as well is that talking about how oral anticoagulants may also reduce the risk of cognitive decline, in the preceding sentence, it already talks about how it can prevent blood clot formation, which reduces the risk of stroke. And so really it falls under this same category of the benefits of these drugs. And so we can really simplify this quite a bit. And so what I actually want to do is I'm going to delete a lot of this. I'm actually going to delete all of these details. Many studies have indicated that using oral anticoagulants, because we care more about the effect that these drugs have on cognitive decline versus that many studies have showed something. So we're going to delete that. And instead, I'm going to change this period to a comma and then add the conjunction and. And so now we have these drugs can prevent blood clot formation in the heart, which reduces the risk of stroke and may also reduce the risk of cognitive decline. Now that I've read that out loud, I notice that I have reduces here and reduce here. And so to mix up the verbs, because they are the energy sources or the mitochondria of your writing, I'm going to change this second instance to lower. And so now we have these drugs can prevent blood clot formation in the heart, which reduces the risk of stroke and may also lower the risk of cognitive decline. By the way, if you are inspired to revise this example, I'd love to see your revision in the comments below. We can all learn different ways to write by seeing how other people might revise the text. In fact, in my Scientific Writing Simplified course, we have weekly exercises like this where I post an excerpt that members can revise and share. And it's so much fun to see the different ways that people revise the excerpt. And it's the most popular space in the Academy. I'll add a link to the description box in case you want to check out the course. Okay, let's get back to the example. So I think that second sentence is in pretty good shape. And so now we're going to tackle the third sentence. So this sentence, there's a lot of things that I notice. First of all, we are starting with a transition, however, and transitions can be really helpful if you use them as signposts to let readers know that you're going to be moving in a different direction. And so the however is adding a contrast transition to let the readers know we've talked about this, now we're going to shift gears a little bit. Now, transitions can be helpful when they're used in this way. Sometimes authors can use transitions as a way to try to stitch together the writing, and actually it's much better to connect them by the subjects to content in the preceding sentence that I talked about before. And so you really want to avoid just using them to stitch things together and instead really focus on fine-tuning the flow. But in this case, this transition is really helpful. So here we also have the optimal use of, I want to pay attention to the optimal use in between the and the of. I want to be wary of that kind of language. I also notice necessitates. That's a long word that we can easily replace with needs. We're going to do a little more work, I think, but that one, my first instinct is to just change it to needs. And we have patient education, and that patients actively engage in the management of their condition. So the management of. So I mentioned earlier about nominalizations and to be wary of words that are between the and of. So here, management is a nominalization. And nominalizations tend to end in suffixes, in this case, ment. They also end in other suffixes, often tion or sion. There are various other ones, and I've written an article on this. I'll add a link to it in the description box in case you want to learn a little bit more about the different suffixes and how you can revise them. But this is something that we want to simplify. Because another challenge with nominalizations is that they drain the energy from your writing. And when you drain the energy, it means you're draining the persuasion. And so we are going to want to extract the verb manage from management. Now, I'll also point out that there's another nominalization in here, education. Technically, a nominalization ends in tion. It is derived from the verb educate. However, in this case, education is a helpful technical term, and so it's okay to use it. It's not jargony like management is. And again, I go into these details in that particular article. Okay, so let's start to revise this sentence. This one's going to be a little bit more complex. So in this sentence, the subject is the optimal use of oral anticoagulants, which is a lot. And so one thing that I also notice is that this is sort of like an if-then statement, that to optimize the use of these, we need to do this thing. And so that is how I want to revise this. And also in this way, we're going to add an actor. So the optimal use of oral anticoagulants is a little bit abstract, and so we want to add a concrete actor. So what I'm going to do is change this to say to optimize, and then we have use of, and I mentioned before, I don't tend to like use of, so I'm actually going to say treatment with. And that way it's also, the other thing about use is it's vague. What does use actually mean? And so by changing it to treatment, it is being more direct about exactly how the anticoagulants are being used. And so we have now, however, to optimize treatment with oral anticoagulants, I'm going to make the subject of this now patients. Now, the great thing about changing the subject of this sentence to patients is, one, patients is concrete, and there's a human in there, and we can relate to that human, but also the subject of the very first sentence is patients. And so because both of these sentences have the subject of patients, it's going to help tie the last sentence to the first sentence. And in that way, it helps to tie everything together. So we're going to use patients. And in this case, we remove the word need, or necessitates is what it was before, but we're going to say patients need education. And now we have, and that patients actively engage. We don't need patients twice. So we want to say that patients need education and to actively engage in the management of their condition. That is really wordy, to have to actively engage in the management of their condition. Instead, I'm going to actually cut this out, engage in the, because if you're managing something, you're engaging in it. So we're going to delete that, and then we want to deal with this nominalization. So we're going to take off the suffix and say to actively manage their condition. So now the last sentence is, however, to optimize treatment with oral anticoagulants, patients need education and to actively manage their condition. So now it's more concise and it's following a logical order, and it's also connecting to the preceding sentences. So this example has the same structure as the original, which we already decided was a great structure. And the sentences, let's look at the sentence lengths. So the first one, we have 10 words. The second one, we have 25 words. And then the last one, we have 17 words. And so we've also mixed up lengths of sentences, 10, 25, and 17 words. And all of the lengths are 25 words or less. And if we look at the total word length, we are now at 51, which is down from 69. So it's a little bit of a difference. It's not huge, but if you do this throughout an entire document, it's going to have a huge change. And I will say too that this is a first pass. And so if I were to read this again, and depending on the context of where it is in the document, I might make some additional changes. So Let's take a look at the before and after. So I'm going to read both of them. So the before version was one of the primary therapies for atrial fibrillation patients is the use of oral anticoagulants, which can effectively prevent blood clot formation in the heart, thereby reducing the risk of a stroke. Numerous studies have indicated that using oral anticoagulants may also reduce the risk of cognitive decline. However, the optimal use of oral anticoagulants necessitates patient education and that patients actively engage in the management of their condition. Now let's look at the after. Patients with atrial fibrillation are often treated with oral anticoagulants. These drugs can prevent blood clot formation in the heart, which reduces the risk of stroke and may also lower the risk of cognitive decline. However, to optimize treatment with oral anticoagulants, patients need education and to actively manage their condition. This version is much clearer and more concise and much more enjoyable to read. Now, I do want to add one quick other caveat or thing to keep in mind, which is this example does not contain any citations. And depending on where the citations need to be placed and what information might be in those particular references, we would need to make different considerations about how things are worded. So that is something to keep in mind as you are revising text that you are working on, that you may not be able to make these types of exact changes depending on where the citations are and the exact meaning that you intend and the most accurate and precise language to reflect what's actually in the publication. So I've covered a lot of tips in real time in this video, and there are links to articles in the description box if you want to learn more about some of the topics that I covered. But some of the topics require a much deeper dive than a short article can cover. And if you want to take that dive, I highly recommend checking out my Scientific Writing Simplified course. I'd be thrilled to have you. And if you want a preview of one of the topics that I cover in that course, at the end of this video, I'll link to a video about the built-in story structure of original research manuscripts. And if there's something in particular that you'd like to learn more about, let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you in the next video.